All of these seemingly ordinary images have something in common. They were all taken down by Chinese internet censors for alluding to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Meanwhile, just across the Taiwan Strait, an inflatable version of Tankman appeared in the middle of Taiwan's Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall on May 21st, just weeks before the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. 3 decades ago, this anonymous man stood in front of a convoy of tanks just one night after thousands of protesters had been killed in one of modern China's most violent military crackdowns. Tankman has become a symbol of defiance and peaceful protest around the world, except in China. To understand why China chooses to wipe out such a significant part of its history, we need to dive into what caused the protests in the first place. You're watching Explore Mode, and today we're diving into the Tiananmen Square protests. First, let's get acquainted with these two guys, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Mao is widely known for founding the Chinese Communist Party, writing the infamous Little Red Book, the Cultural Revolution. The list goes on. What's relevant to this story, though, was his plan for economic reform, which was meant to help China surpass its Western competitors in the late 50s. The plan was known as the Great Leap Forward. It was supposed to catapult China from a mainly agrarian country to an industrialized powerhouse in a span of 5 years, by separating its population into communes where citizens would focus on achieving certain economic targets. Sounds good, right? Except it wasn't. The leap was anything but great. Not if you're not a fan of catastrophic levels of environmental damage, famine, family separation, and death anyway. Policies for the Great Leap lasted roughly 3 years, but the effects were disastrous. Mao's strategies failed greatly. Roughly 45 million people died as a result of famine and execution punishments if they failed to achieve goals. Mao then tried to fix this huge no-no by starting the Cultural Revolution. But that's a whole other thing. Let's flash forward to China under Deng Xiaoping. Deng took over after Mao's death in the late 70s. His views on economic policies were much more pragmatic, and it was during his rule that China opened to foreign markets. Poverty levels plummeted, China's GDP rose exponentially, and diplomatic relations improved. I mean, look at him here in a visit in the US, wearing a silly cowboy hat. Oh, Deng, you goofball. Things were going well. Hooray, right? Well, hooray for a while. In the late 80s, prices in China soared. Inflation went from 7.3% in 1987 to 20% in a single year. On top of that, an economic reform called the dual-track system benefited those in higher economic and political positions, leading to resentment from the general population. So, corruption plus inflation plus economic disparity sounds like the perfect recipe for civil unrest. Which leads us to another guy. Well, the death of this guy, unfortunately, Yaobang. Hu was once a close advisor to Deng and was liked among students for his reformist views, but he was forced to resign after being too lenient when dealing with student protests in 1986 and 1987. Because how dare he appeal to the youth of China? In late April 1989, Hu dies of a heart attack. His passing was the perfect excuse for students to both commemorate the leader as well as air out their discontent with the party. The protests quickly expanded as the students were joined by workers, public officials, professors, and intellectuals, all of whom were calling for economic reform and an end to authoritarianism. As the protests grew in number, Chinese authorities retaliated by publishing an editorial accusing demonstrators of being anti-party and anti-socialist. Unfortunately for them, the letter actually helped students garner even more support. This is where things start to take a turn for the worse. The Chinese government was expecting a visit from then reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in mid-May. At the same time, protesters had gone on a hunger strike and demonstrations were expanding to other cities in the country. When Gorbachev arrived in Beijing, China's Great Hall of the People, where foreign politicians are usually welcome, was, well, filled with people. Hungry people. International media captured the whole shebang, leaving China rightfully embarrassed. Days after, authorities declared martial law, and on June 4th, Chinese military violently took over Tiananmen Square armed with tanks and weapons. They opened fire against the unarmed students and ran over demonstrators with their tanks. 'Cause there's nothing more dangerous than defenseless bike-riding, sign-wielding youth, am I right? For more news animations and explainers, hit the subscribe and bell button to join the TomoNews family. Thanks for watching.